All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the 32nd ACM conference on hypertext and social media. My name is Nicole Basaraba, and I am the chair of this first keynote session today. I recently completed my PhD at Trinity College last year, so I'm an alumnus of the ADAPT Center and the Trinity College, and right now I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Maastricht University. So since today is the first session, I'll just give everyone a couple of reminders. So firstly, we'll use the chat to write down any questions you might have for the speakers while they're giving their talk. And I'll also open up the floor afterwards so that anyone who wishes to ask a question directly, feel free to do so by raising your hand. As a reminder, the event is being recorded, as you may have just heard the announcement there. So if you don't feel comfortable with your video on, you're still able to ask a question with your voice activated if you choose. Of course, you can use the chat and I can read out the question there as well. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to today's keynote address titled Multimodality and Hypertext, Theoretical and Empirical Considerations. It's being given jointly by Professor John Bateman and Tuomo Hiippala, who I had the pleasure of meeting in 2017 in Bremen. So John Bateman is a professor of applied linguistics at Bremen University in Germany, and his research in the past 15 years has focused on a variety of modalities, and he has made major contributions to expanding our understanding of semiotics in his extensive publications. Tuomo Hiippala is an assistant professor in English literature and digital humanities at the University of Helsinki in Finland. His research focuses on multiple modes of expression and interaction and how they cooperate with each other in different communicative situations. He also released a really useful introductory series on YouTube recently on applied language technology. So I encourage you to check that out later and share it with your students and colleagues. And I'll post that later in the chat and also on Discord so you can take a peek. So I'd like to thank our wonderful speakers, and I'll pass it over to you to begin.
Yeah, thank you very much. So what we're going to do now with John is that I'll get started and I'll start with the outline of the talk. So what we're going to talk about first is generally the theories of multimodality, and specifically how the notion of materiality relates to theories of multimodality. And then we're going to be talking about things like discourse semantics, which lend coherence to multimodal communication, and then we'll proceed to discuss hypertext from the perspective of multimodality. And first of all, I'd like to start by talking about multimodality as a phenomenon. So the phenomenon of multimodality is studied across diverse disciplines. So let's say if you go to a group of conversation analysts who study face-to-face interaction, they will probably tell you that to them, multimodality means coordinated language, gestures, posture, and gaze. But then again, if you go to a group of researchers who study human-computer interaction, then they will probably understand multimodality as a kind of combination of spoken language, touch, gaze, and any other means of interacting with computers. But there is also this emerging discipline, which can be called multimodality research, that studies the core principles of multimodality and multimodal communication, and how we generally as humans use intentional combinations of multiple modes of expression when we communicate and interact. So what I'd like to do next is to take a deep dive into some contemporary theories and concepts in multimodality research, and then we'll see how those can help us understand the relationship between multimodality and hypertext. So first of all, I'd like to get started with the foundational concept of materiality, which has been discussed extensively in multimodality research, where it is often understood as the way we use the human body to communicate, not just to produce spoken language or signs and gestures and so on, but also how we use our bodies to access and shape various kinds of physical materialities for communicative purposes. And this kind of intentional manipulation of different materialities is very typical behavior of humans and has been so for a long time. So if you think about something like these rock paintings shown here in the lower right-hand corner from Kirkkonummi, west of Helsinki, Finland, to these kind of embroidered tapestries from northern France, and all the way to just ordinary everyday face-to-face interaction. In each case, there is some materiality that's being manipulated for communicative purposes. And how this works is because these materialities can bear traces of intentional manipulation. And by observing these properties, or the properties of the materialities and the traces they carry, can already help us move forward in distinguishing between different communicative situations. So we can ask, what kinds of traces can some materiality support? And if we start from a simple example, or maybe not so simple, like the web interface to the social media platform Twitter, shown here in the center and top, then we can think of this piece of or this artifact in terms of its materiality. And if we think first of all the traces in terms of their temporality, then we can say that the underlying materiality is dynamic because the traces can move. And in terms of space, the materiality is two-dimensional. That means it is being accessed in or via a two-dimensional artifact. But of course, you can represent three-dimensional things within that materiality as well. Then in terms of the role of somebody interacting with this materiality, you commonly take on the role of an observer when dealing with this kind of materiality. And in terms of transience, this materiality is permanent, so the traces remain in sight. Now, we can contrast this materiality that hosts all of these traces that do some communicative work for us to a news broadcast. And in this case, the situation is pretty similar, except for transience, where we have the traces exhibiting this kind of fleeting phenomena. So they're constantly being replaced by incoming traces. So this is the kind of usual optical flow that you see in any audiovisual media. And now if you're thinking like, okay, how does that help us move forward? Because you quite often see moving things on Twitter, you see embedded videos and animated GIFs and so on, then you're absolutely on the right track, because even if the materiality has the potential to carry certain kinds of traces, it does not necessarily mean that this kind of potential is being drawn on. So in this case, we can see that, you know, if you have materialities with compatible properties, then they may be related to each other in different ways. For example, by embedding one kind of materiality within another. So this is why we can have so moving images embedded within something like a web interface to a social media platform. But it's important to pull out these kind of distinctions so that we can then start considering what kinds of resources for communication may be deployed on these materialities. And thus the next question would be, what makes these kind of traces meaningful? So in order for any trace on some materiality to become meaningful, it must adhere to some principles of organization. So they cannot be random. And this kind of organization is provided by Semiotic Modes, which is a concept in multimodality theory that is often understood as these kind of socially shared resources for communication, which emerge when some community of users starts to establish some kind of regularities in the use of the materiality for communicative purposes. And up to the extent that then these regularities of form are no longer dependent on the underlying materiality. So if you think about something like written language, you can use that semiotic mode basically anywhere where you have some materiality with a two-dimensional spatial extent. So it's not anymore tied to some specific materiality, but more relies on certain kinds of material properties. And what comes to definitions of semiotic modes, contemporary approaches to the notion of semiotic mode generally assume that they have three strata that are required for a fully articulated semiotic mode. First of all, you need to have the strata of a material substrate, which defines what kind of materiality is needed to deploy the semiotic mode in question. Then you have expressive resources, the so-called regularities of form that are associated with a given semiotic mode. And generally, these expressive resources allow you to make choices among alternatives and combine them into larger units. And finally, we have the stratum of discourse semantics, which then refers to mechanisms that support the interpretation of the expressive resources in context. So essentially, they are responsible for generating hypotheses about what some expressive resources mean in some given context. And now if you're thinking that all of this talk is very abstract and what are you supposed to do with this, then you're absolutely right, but this is a generic model and thus applicable to all kinds of potential semiotic modes. And just to exemplify, I'm just going to draw on some of our recent work on diagrams, the so-called diagrammatic mode, which can be used to create all sorts of diagrammatic representations. And if we look at the diagrammatic mode along these three strata, beginning from the material substrate at the bottom, then I think to create or to instantiate diagrams, one needs to have at least a two-dimensional and observable materiality, which can then deploy or various kinds of expressive resources that are compatible with this material substrate, such as written language, illustrations, schematic drawings, and photography, and diagrammatic elements, and layout. And these expressive resources can be then combined into discourse organizations whose interpretation is supported by the discourse semantics. Now, when one is doing multimodal analysis and attempting to describe a single semiotic mode, for example, one needs to pursue the analysis on multiple strata. So everything across these three strata is up for grabs. So one needs to consider what kinds of material configurations are typically involved when this semiotic mode is being used somewhere. What are the expressive resources? How are they organized? What kinds of choices they allow? How can they be combined into larger units? And then, of course, one needs to describe the kind of mechanisms that support their interpretation. And all of this then should give one a fuller picture of the semiotic mode and what it does. But answering all of these questions naturally requires empirical research. And this is one of the key points that I want to make, that if you work with notions that are pre-theoretical, that you simply assume that you have modes such as text or image, those are rarely sufficient for describing individual semiotic modes or their combinations in some artifact, for example. So one should always assume that one cannot really know which semiotic modes you're going to encounter. You need to do the empirical work and analyze them first. And now I'd like to focus a bit more before we continue on the stratum of discourse semantics, because it plays a crucial role. And to be more specific, the stratum is responsible for supporting the interpretation of semiotic modes and their combinations by setting up discourse units and discourse that may hold between them. And this is particularly relevant for the structure of multimodal discourse, because every time you're engaging with some multimodal discourse, you're constantly doing inferencing, trying to make sense of what's being presented to you and what the different combinations of semiotic modes actually attempt to communicate. And this is what discourse semantic does. And this process is inherently dynamic and abductive and non-monotonic. So any inference is constantly updated as more evidence becomes available. And of course, when you try to make sense of a combination of, let's say, a written language label in this diagram and a diagrammatic element like a line, and the illustrations and the outline, then naturally one draws on what is being presented plus your world knowledge. And what discourse semantics tries to do is maximize coherence in multimodal discourse by providing the best explanation for some co-deployment of modes. And in this case, if you think about this example, if we're able to, let's say, identify discourse units here by just simply assuming that this is a diagram, then probably if you look at the label and the line and then its target, the illustration, the most plausible explanation here is some kind of part-whole structure where the written label is used to pick out parts of the illustration for description. But these are not fixed, although they are highly conventionalized. I want to show you another example from another diagram. In this case, you also have two instances of semiotic modes being related using a diagrammatic element, such as this arrow right here. But here, of course, to arrive to the most plausible explanation, one needs to treat this cutout here, which is actually a kind of like an entire diagrammatic structure, as a discourse unit of its own, and then figure out how that relates to the illustration of a leaf up here. So here the question is, of course, whether this is some kind of part-whole structure where the diagrammatic cutout elaborates the illustration, or maybe the illustration provides some background, as in, if you pick out a part of a leaf like this and then examine it using a microscope, then maybe this is the kind of structure that you will find. All of this comes together very dynamically, but the key thing is that one needs to constantly make these kind of discourse semantic interpretations, and crucial part is that one needs to identify and apply the discourse semantics that provides the kind of appropriate interpretations. And in this case, of course, that semiotic mode and the discourse semantics are from the diagrammatic mode, so it doesn't really make sense to try to interpret this as some kind of depiction of reality, for example, when it comes to the cutout. That's obviously an abstraction. And what I also want to stress that this takes place at various different levels of abstraction all the time when you're engaging with entire artifacts. So in multimodality research, the notion of medium is typically understood as these kind of socially and historically situated practices of manipulating some materiality for communicative purposes. And this is where new semiotic modes and their combinations are born, and where they grow up and evolve. But in this case, if you think about a medium such as a website, you pretty much know what you're going to get and why are you, let's say, visiting one to get up-to-date information on what's happening in the world. If you engage with a medium like this, then you're bound to be doing discourse semantic interpretations involving various semiotic modes all the time. So if we talk in terms of a semiotic mode like page flow, which is an abstraction used to describe the mode that organizes instances of other semiotic modes into meaningful units in 2D space, then just to make sense of this, the organization of this landing page, one needs to apply those discourse semantics to understand that these form the so-called kind of news bites, where you have some short description of the news and then maybe some news photography to accompany the written language. And of course, then if one engages with something like this news bite here, then you also need to apply the discourse semantics of news photography, which have been studied quite extensively in recent years by researchers such as Helen Capel. So news photography obviously has its own conventions, so one shouldn't maybe apply the, let's say, discourse semantics of fashion photography in this instance, for example. And then, of course, if you move to another news bite, then you might have to apply the discourse semantics of news video, so something that unfolds then in time, and of course that generates expectations towards what is to come later on. Now that we have moved already towards digital media, then I'm going to pass the microphone to John, who will now take us towards hypertext from the perspective of multimodality.
Right, so we've seen now from what Tuomo was describing a pretty broad and very quick view of some of the basic concepts that we have been developing for multimodality over the various years. It's important to emphasize, as Tuomo then mentioned, that this is driven by an empirical concern. The empirical concerns are that we are engaging with a whole range of different kinds of media, and on the basis of the analyses have developed the framework both for theoretical descriptions and for supporting the empirical work further. So what I'm going to do in this part of the talk is to take hypertext as an example of a medium that we might engage with, applying some of the principles and constructs that Tuomo has now introduced. Now, I'm going to do this in various ways. I'm going to refer back to some of the classical introductions or classical definitions of hypertext and try and relate or draw a bridge between these and our multimodality research. Now, I'm going to emphasize up front here that hypertext has not been a specific target of our research. So I'm starting here more or less as we do if we came in from the cold and said, and talking with you guys here at the conference, saying like, oh, hypertext, okay, let's look at hypertext. And what do we say from that from the perspective of multimodality? To the extent that we agree and we say, you would say, oh yeah, that's what we do, then I'm happy. To the extent that we find places where there are perhaps disagreements, then that's also interesting. So I'm going to start here looking at hypertext. And we see some of the earliest discussion as introduced. I'm going to try and problematize that by considering it as monomodal. And this is not a particular problem of hypertext studies, of course. There have been, until the last 15 years, there have been not that strong of principles or theories of how to deal with multimodality when it gets serious. And so hypertext, in its treatment of the notion of text, I'm going to suggest has been rather monomodal, and I'll draw some consequences for that. Now, one of these, if we go here to this early quote, by hypertext, I simply mean non-sequential writing. A magazine layout with sequential text and inset illustrations of boxes is thus hypertext. Now, some of us might agree with that still or might disagree with that. What we're going to do from the perspective of multimodality is try and make this a more addressable issue. What follows from that? We've seen in Tuomo's part just how complex some of those magazine layouts and things like them, like diagrams, can become. So we need to not allow that complexity to phase us in any way. We need to be in control of that. So if we lump everything together as simply hypertext being anything that's non-sequential, then this does group together very different kinds of concerns. And I will suggest perhaps not in the optimal way. So let's take that a little bit further. I'm going to presume, as I said at the beginning, that we're coming from a happy Pacific island where we do multimodality theory, and we've never seen something like hypertext before. So we're coming in from the warm in this case, not in from the cold, and we're looking around and we see, okay, let's see what this phenomenon is. Our multimodality theory, as it's been developed, combines two perspectives, two facets. One is very empirical, more or less corpus-based, where we use multimodal analysis methodology, particularly concerning materiality, as Tuomo was introducing it, in order to look at what's there. And what do we look at when we're looking at what's there? Well, this is almost ethnographic. What do people call hypertext? What do they do with it? What do they want from it? So if somebody comes to us and say, look, I've got some hypertext here, then how does that fit? In parallel to this, then we have the theoretical semiotic mechanisms and methods to draw on, where based upon the reasonably robust and sophisticated theory that we have been developing on multimodality, we can start talking about just what kind of communication is involved in these artifacts, which have been pointed out to us as being perhaps labelable as hypertext. Now, a monomodal view of what text is something which I want to problematize, and this is on the right-hand side here is always my classical example of a text that's trying to be as monomodal as it can be. We don't find many texts like that anymore. This one happens to be German, but we can find examples in other languages. This text is just trying to pretend that it doesn't exist on the page at all. It's just a continuous flow of words. And this is really trying to be monomodal. Now, again, taking these quotes here, we have all traditional text, whether in printed form or computer files, is sequential. And I take this to be the monomodal view. And this is exactly what you see trying to be realized, although again, not succeeding because it's impossible, that the text is trying to be monomodal. Then going on, we have, it is the representation of whole structures of ideas, which we are trying to get at with this more sophisticated view from hypertext. And now Nelson here then has in brackets saying writing is the presentation of thought. Okay, so he wants to extend and have a nice view of writing. So are pictures and diagrams, but they are intrinsically non-sequential and so not relevant to the present argument. Now, I think this was one of those forking branches where you go in the wrong direction, because it's absolutely essential to the present argument, since much of what we need to know in order to deal with these sophisticated forms of communication is essentially diagrammatic. They're operating diagrammatically. And this is not something which is strange or put in a box which is different from everything else, pictures and diagrams. This is something which applies throughout. And so we need to be open to this, since we need to be looking at semiotic modes like this current one, which we saw before with the news report, and even stuff like this, which is like some other of the media which we have been looking at. This is horribly, horribly complicated and non-sequential as well as being sequential, as well as being image, as well as being text, as well as being a whole bunch of other things. And when we get serious about analyzing this kind of multimodal complexity, then we need the corresponding theoretical mechanisms in order to deal with it, not only theoretically, but also empirically. Now I'm going to build a bridge here, something which we have also been drawing on with Espen Aarseth's notion of ergodic literature. Now, many of you, I assume almost all of you, will know this body of work since it has been related to hypertext, extensions of hypertext. And Aarseth here says that, well, ergodic literature, for example, hypertext literature, is where you have a non-trivial effort to make the reader, or have the reader, or the reader needs to do this effort to traverse the text. And then he says, if ergodic literature is to make sense, there must also be non-ergodic literature, where the effort to traverse the text is trivial. For example, eye movement and turning of pages. Now, as we know from doing empirical multimodal research, There's nothing very trivial about the kind of activities which eye movement shows. There's a lot of very, very complex stuff going on. So rather than draw a hard and sharp boundary, ergodic and non-ergodic, ergodic and non-ergodic, we have in our account built up a more, it's not a continuum because there are divisions here, but there's a span, a range, where we have right at the simplest form of materiality in a way, at the bottom, the embedded box there is linear, where we have semiotic modes, which really are constrained strongly to be sequential. Written language and spoken language are of this type. But we also have what we characterize as microergodic, where this, for example, the comic page would have been very much like this, where you have to do some work and non-trivial work in getting information from these complex compositions. We also then have, going over to things which are more similar to what Asa already or actually talks about, where we have different forms of ergodic: immutable, where its content is given in advance, you'd have to do exploring, and mutable, where you actually then do some changing of the materials. As we'll see in a minute, this mutable ergodic actually has some very strong connections with forms of interaction which we are extremely familiar with. And drawing these connections will then become very important. So now let's start focusing in on trying to have an example of applying some of the notions of materiality to the hypertext artifact or artifacts or class of artifacts, however we characterize these as we move on. And there's this nice issue or notion of the problem of orientation. Where do you know where you are? And with classical material objects, then there are a whole bunch of cues, for example, how thick the book is, or remembering where things were on the page. And this is, of course, a difficult issue when those kind of physicalities are no longer available. But physicalities are still available and can be made available. And this is where we move from classical notions of physical materiality to digital materialities, where we also have done a lot of work characterizing, well, what does that mean, digital materiality? So we can say more about that or talk about that in discussion if that then becomes relevant, because one thing which it does not have is a lot of zeros and ones. This is not the level at which semiotic interaction with artifacts works. So let's look at the materiality of hypertext. Classically, in multimodality studies, we tend to draw a lot of long-range trajectories to see how media have really developed over time. So this goes back to McLuhan and others with the notion that new media develop out of old media. Well, how does that work? How does that really work when we go to the multimodality? So I'm going to build up the notion of a materiality of hypertext in 2, 3 easy steps. I'm going to start with actual physical devices, where you actually then have to do something physically to change what you're looking at. And we go back here again to the notion of materiality and our method of slicing it, embedding. And a typical physical thing, if you're turning a page, then you are in a particular material situation, and you need to do some physical action in order to change the content that you have access to. Now, this remains when we start moving away from the physical, from the classical thing, like having a scroll which you're unwinding, or even a microfiche, for any of you who remember what those devices were, where you might actually have to move something to look at something else. So this is a beginning. This is a collection of media which have these properties. So if we move on, we can characterize these slices exactly as Tuomo did right at the beginning in terms of their spatial properties, temporal role of the interactor or interpreter, and whether they are changing or permanent. And each of these different slices has different material properties, and each collection of material properties allows support for different kinds of semiotic modes. And this is where you have the link to empirical work, where getting your notion of materiality clearer then gives you strong guidance for what semiotic modes will then be relevant for your discussion and which you can then investigate. So we have this idea of going from scroll to book to microfiche, and then even to having a next button on a digital device. It's very much the same kind of thing. Moving onwards, we see a very classical, traditional, this happens all the time. As soon as we're in digital materialities, it becomes possible to design into the materiality some of these previous physical properties. So securing access to content can actually be part of the design of what then we are being presented with. And we see this in many, many different digital devices. For example, and very nice, some work has looked at things like digital cameras. Compare digital cameras with physical cameras, where physical cameras, you need to move dials around and whatever, and you look in the digital camera, and those dials have been moved into the interface, into what you're being presented with. So this is then a very typical property of digital materialities, moving some of this control into what then appears as the content. Such materialities then seamlessly merge the contributions of the semiotic modes involved, because and this is again not something specific to hypertext or specific to anything very much. All materialities do this. For example, we can take the next classic or an old-fashioned example here, which we've analyzed. Take this thing from Apollinaire, this concrete poem there. And if we ask here our typical empirical multimodality question, the question is, well, which material regularities are there and which semiotic modes take responsibility for those traces? And if we look at this one, we can see there are at least two. There is the written verbal language, where we're actually using the semiotic mode there of verbal language, but that would not be enough. If we just had this, then there would be many properties of the materiality of this artifact that we haven't yet explained. If we add in schematic pictorial representations, because actually the shape here is meant to look like a tie, then we have begun to have a reasonable account of what materialities are being used in which ways, and these are all combined. This is why separation into text and images is often not a very good strategy to take when we look at more complex multimodal artifacts. Now, this is exactly what we see is happening in the hypertext situation as well. The digital materiality is merging contributions of semiotic modes. So our empirical question then becomes, which semiotic modes? Now, at the bottom, we can see here that any semiotic mode which can be used in this material, and if it's a digital material of a 2D display, then that's a huge number of semiotic modes. We need not make any distinction here between the diagrams and written text. All of these are included, video, photographs, whatever. They are all available either directly or as by embedding media. But we also have the semiotic mode of navigation, where we have the particular role of the hyperlinks. So putting these then together is then the role of discourse semantics, or falls to discourse semantics. And this is a very beneficial way to start looking at more of the sophisticated links which have been suggested, or treatments have been suggested for hyperlinks, where you are in hypertext literature, where you are actually using part of the discourse semantics of the text, for example, in order to bridge over to what you're linking to. This is a classical case of coherence arising from discourse semantics. So to bring us to the discussion points, I want to just run through here several ideas and suggestions which come out of this way of thinking about hypertext from multimodality. And I'll be running through these very, very quickly so we can get to the discussion. And that is going through them in order. So the first one is moving towards externalized digelicity. I mentioned Arset's notion of ergodicity, and I showed a diagram before where at the top of the list was mutable ergodicity, where you actually have to do some work to make the content which is being then constructed. And I think it's useful here to really emphasize, this is exactly what multi-party face-to-face interactional conversation already is. This is exactly the level of material complexity which face-to-face interaction is. And we know a considerable amount about how that works. And particularly looking at the centrality of micro-sequential co-achievement as the conversation analysis and analyses people would call it. This needs then to be applied whenever we're looking at mutable ergodicity. This is absolutely essential. Otherwise, we'll have theoretical gaps. What is added in hypertext is the externalization of the processual nature of that interaction. And that really is a very interesting new additional feature, which we can then focus on particularly here, regardless of which, so if we go to hypermedia, regardless of what semiotic modes are being drawn from. So that's one thing which I think is very important. And this is a diagram from our introductory textbook where we go through the different kinds of work which different materialities require of their users. And you can see right at the top, we have a face-to-face embodied conversation. And examples of that would be something like completely immersive games and cybertext of that kind. So moving to the next one, hypertext as medium and hypertext as text. I think it's useful to separate these very clearly. So hypertext as a medium is where, for example, one might be browsing the web, following links, and this is providing various input for knowledge construction. And the knowledge may be combined or not, depending upon interests. And this is a digital materiality designed with certain affordances. We also have, quite separate from that, and I think an interest of many people, certainly some of the participants here, is that hypertext is a more bounded. That doesn't mean fixed. It just means that we can put it in a bag, say. It's a communicative event which maintains multilinearity as a design feature. Now, in terms of discourse structure, this is something which is perfectly fine. A discourse structure does not commit you to the kind of linearity which one sees in monomodal approaches or talk of traditional text. Discourse structure doesn't have to be like that. In fact, it very rarely is. So again, here, if we separate those out, then we have some, I think, a fairly robust scaffold for work. So if we use that and go further, we can start distinguishing various kinds of uses. So we might have on one side of the web, where you can more or less do what you like. And this doesn't have its own principles of coherence. It's very much in the hypertext as medium kind of digital materiality. If we go over to user interfaces to particular computational systems, then this is also click and point, but it's a very, very different kind of genre. And again, has different kind of properties. Newspaper, website, again, different genre. And a hypertext, I put there the A as something like a hypernarrative. Then again, this can be related to the others, but is also very different. We could think here and leave it as a point for discussion of where social media fits on that, because it also fits in that. I'll leave that as an exercise. An exercise. We can also define distinct kinds of sequentiality very clearly. Sequentiality is not just sequentiality. Sequentiality has different properties depending upon where it comes from in the semiotic modes. Either we have built into the materiality, we have it built into the expressive resources in terms of syntagmatic patterns, as in syntax in language. It doesn't make sense to get rid of that kind of sequentiality because the entire semiotic mode then collapses. We also have different sequentiality applying to the discourse semantics. It has very different properties. And this then generalizes across all semiotic modes. Doesn't matter if they're visual or nonverbal or dynamic, the same holds. And I think then finally, we can go back to this more than troubled relation to thought. We go right back to Vannevar Bush and go right back to some of the origins. Hypertexts are good because they mirror thought. What does this mean? There are reasons why stream of consciousness writing, which might be said to mirror thought, is really challenging to read. And there are several reasons here. Many reasons. I'm not going to go into it too seriously, but one person's associations or another person's distractions, unless they're documented. And this leads us to, again, back to text design. Text design is there to guide interpretations towards coherence across all the semiotic modes that you're using. This doesn't entail fixed, unique interpretations. This would be a misreading of what coherence is. So functional hypertext really needs to be written just as well as any other text. And if we make other assumptions that we don't need to do this, I think this seriously misconstrues just the semiotic nature of communication and discourse as such. And so that's something to be very wary of. So thanks from me, and also thanks from Tuomo, and we are looking forward to any questions. And again, that can be now because time is short. Follow up with email or whatever. We'll be very happy to hear from you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. That was an excellent talk. I have to say, I wrote down a lot of questions and then they were answered during the talk. So, but first I'll open up the floor to see if there is anyone in the audience who wants to ask a question. So if you do, feel free either to type it in the chat or use the raise hand button or turn on your video so I know that you would like to ask a question. So I'll just pause for a second to see if anyone has any questions. I might start then with one of my own. So one of the things that I did in my research as well is multimodal discourse analysis for websites, and it has lots of complex content, and you can, when you're analyzing these kinds of data sets, you can analyze it with many layers, like the GEM layers of analysis. One question I was thinking about is metadata something that needs to be considered as a modality for analysis? Because my hypothesis is that a lot of content creators these days don't think about the metadata when they're publishing or may not include it, and especially for accessibility. For example, with people who might be blind or hard of seeing, if there's no alt text on an image, or if the URL for a hypermedia link isn't descriptive, it just has a bunch of numbers and you're not clear. Is this a type of modality that can or should be researched in the future on these kinds of texts?
I could start maybe just very quickly. We tend to be very, very strict these days in terms of what the use of semiotic modality is. Mm-hmm. This is not traditional in multimodal research. In multimodal research, traditional, any old thing can be a semiotic mode. We tend to reject that categorically. We have very specific properties which a semiotic mode has to have in order to be addressable. Otherwise, the entire empirical and theoretical framework doesn't apply. So we're very against loose usages. Mm-hmm. So the type of phenomena which you're drawing attention to are absolutely essential. They are part of the semiotic modes which are used within that medium. Mm-hmm. And if you have deficits there, it's exactly as the same. We tend to draw a lot of connections because we see a lot of similarities. Phenomena keep coming back again and again and again, depending upon what different media you're working with. But then a similar phenomenon. So it's very similar to leaving out information. Just take a written text and leave out half the words. Are you doing a good job? No. And It's exactly the same if you go over to a hypertext and have a really terrible link, for whatever reason terrible is. And we can then start taking apart all the different ways it can be terrible, because there are very, very many, as we know. But yes, these of course have to be studied, but they have a proper place in the framework as part of the expressive resources of a semiotic mode. And we have particular communicative tasks to be performed. And if the expressive resources do not support those tasks, that's a problem. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't say metadata, yes, that's a mode. No, I would like to take that apart in more detail. But certainly the phenomena you mentioned, absolutely essential.
Yeah, I could maybe add that strikes me as something very typical of digital media or some hypertext kind of medium, because of course content in this media, whatever is being presented using the semiotic modes, is increasingly tailored for different audiences. You get that, for example, on newspaper websites. If you read certain kinds of news, then at least the ones I subscribe to tend to push me those kinds of news that I've been reading up on recently. But I think one can, of course, use different criteria for that as well. So if you're if you cannot see, or if you need some accessibility features, then that's just another kind of customization of the environment so that it can do its communicative work, so to say.
That makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, because I've noticed that designing, oh, we have another question there from David. Feel free to go ahead, David.
Thanks very much. And I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much. I think it's going to take me a little while to process it. There was an awful lot in there. So one of the things that I think people have struggled with hypertext in a similar way to games actually is hypertext a medium, or is it a system for building a medium, right? In other words, every single hypertext effectively, or hypertext implementation, is its own thing. And this, you know, this is similar for games. And one of the reasons for that is that very often the kind of the interaction with the system is where people draw meaning, right? So people talk about ludonarrative in games, for example, and you get the same kind of discussions happening in hypertext around the way that links are used, for example. So you kind of have a discourse that's constructed through the interaction. I just wonder if you could say a little bit about that, and about the kind of the complexities when these different modes become so tightly intertwined that it becomes difficult to distinguish them.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice set of connections to consider explicitly, because when we're in the gaming kind of treatment, then we have exactly the same issue of how to deal with the interactivity and the interactions there. And I think one of the starting points to start dealing with that is going back to how you led into the question, is what I had there with the difference between hypertext as medium and hypertext as text. And these were kind of like two poles. Since one has a different, the notion of hypertext being used as a label for a designed digital materiality with certain properties, I think is very, very important and useful in order to start teasing apart these kind of contributions. And I think it is possible to pull them apart. And as you say, quite rightly, it gets complex when they seem to be very tightly connected. What we found in looking at a lot of media is by taking the semiotic mode approach very seriously, and this is then what I was saying with Nicole of why this is so important, by applying the definitions very, very tightly, then some of these interconnections start becoming easier to deal with, because you start seeing how the contributing phenomena, then they fall apart and they can be played against each other. I think there, because of the complexity of the artifacts that one is beginning to analyze, one really needs a similarly complex theoretical set of tools for getting at it. Otherwise, the artifact is just going to win. It's just going to be too complicated. I think you really need to go in with the sharper tools. And then you can start pulling apart just exactly, well, what kinds of interaction, what kinds of expressive resources, what kind of traces in the materiality are supporting that. And then I think that's how one will begin to make progress. I think it's a very huge number of wide open issues there, but I think that would be the way I'd like to see that going.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, if I could. So I think that's right. And one of the challenges with hypertext is the way that the term itself has become so used in so many different ways. So, for example, I think what you've ended up describing there is what I would call adaptive calligraphic hypermedia, which is a very specific type of hypertext, albeit one which is, you know, the most well known because it's essentially the sort of default interface on the web. But yeah, I think being very precise about these things is very useful. So anyway, thank you for a very thought-provoking presentation.
Thanks, and I think just to follow up on that, I mean, I think it's really good that you have that specific kind of term, because I have share the impression that you said there. Hypertext by itself, I don't think that does the job. It's just as we found when we started talking or seeing about people talking about image and text. That doesn't do the job either. And so if it doesn't work for image and text, then for something which is even more complicated like hypertext, you can imagine how quickly that's just going to go very, very wrong. So I think it's great to start getting that more precise.
Great, thank you. Is there any other questions? I don't see any hand raiser in the chat, so I'll just ask if there's any final ones. If not, I'll take the opportunity to ask one more before we wrap up, and that is a methodological one, because I think there are quite a few members in the audience who might have an interest or specialization in digital humanities as well. And so one question I had in terms of doing these kinds of multimodal discourse analysis is, maybe perhaps starting with the theoretical foundation of the analysis, and then what kinds of tools like computational tools to start a distant reading or a distant viewing. And then, because it's so complex and specific, like an image, like you said, is not descriptive enough. So are we talking about a diagram or a photo or how to balance between theory, the digital tools, and then kind of the more manual analysis required by the researchers?
Maybe I'll take that. This is a very good question, and I, of course, know, and I've done it myself, that there is a lot of excitement, especially in the digital humanities community, about better access to computational tools. So it doesn't take that much expertise loading up some computer vision model and doing, let's say, some object detection or image classification or something that could be understood as distant viewing. But then again, once you apply these kind of analytical frameworks in multimodality research, and the complexity of the artifacts under analysis comes clear, then one needs to think about, okay, what can I use these techniques for? And just to give you an example of the diagrams, for example, if you take a computer vision model trained on photographs and apply to just images of the diagrams, then it's going to be garbage in, garbage out. But then again, if you're able to pick out analytical units out of the diagram and then maybe extract some computational features using some computer vision model from those that roughly at least correspond to the discourse units, then that may already take you much further in terms of understanding how the diagrams, for example, are structured, and actually give you some insights, and you can generally make more of those methods than when you apply them guided by multimodality theory. Or that's at least my argument, that one needs to consider much more carefully the kinds of artifacts you're analyzing before applying any of these tools.
Yes, and then that brings us full circle of making sure as researchers, we use appropriate visualizations and create well-designed interactive text for anyone to read our results to understand. Absolutely. So it kind of, as not only researchers researching multimodality, we have to make sure that what we produce follows our own best practices and theories and guidelines. So with that, I would like to thank you both again very much for this excellent keynote, and I'll now change it over to the next session, which is starting right away here. So thanks again. We have now session 5 starting, called Deception and Attacks, which is being chaired by Pushal Argwal. So if he is here, I will pass him over. If not, to Owen or Ilko to manage. Oh, there you are.